Hi, and welcome to week 4 of the Eclipse Quilt Along. I'm Corinne Wells of Franny B Quilt Company, and we are working on week 4, which is such a fun week because this is the week that we are assembling these blocks. Because this is the Eclipse quilt, I like to call this the moon with the sun rays that are peeking out behind it. So we have assembled our moon already. Last week, we got the moon all assembled, and then we worked on the sun rays, which are the flying geese. So we have sun rays coming off of the moon as well as a flying geese. So you'll see that we have a flying geese unit on each of the 4 sides of the star. And so we are going to be assembling those, but we're going to be using the background pieces. So you can see that each of these stars has 2 longer background pieces that are sewn to a flying geese unit, and those make up 2 of the sides. And then we have a shorter, a square sewn next to the flying geese unit on another side. So what we'll do is first assemble the square with the flying geese unit and the other square. We'll put that on one side of the quilt, or on one side of the block, and on the opposite side of the block. And then on the other side, we'll assemble the rectangle, the flying geese unit, and the other rectangle, and that will complete our block. And that's it for today. So we're doing that for all 20 blocks on our quilt tops. So blocks A, B, C, and D, each of them have 5 moons. And so we're going to be turning that into the Eclipse block on each of the 4 colorways. So I'm going to be walking you through assembling all of those blocks. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that I like to do is I like to get organized. That means I like to make sure I have all of the correct fabrics that I need for each of my sets. That way, if I am sewing across multiple days, I don't lose track of where I am. Sometimes I have a little notepad where I keep notes to myself of what I'm going to need and when, but I find that it's really helpful to just put everything I need, and I know, okay, block A has all the ingredients that it needs to be sewn. So what I'll do is I'll just lay out one of these blocks to show you how it is supposed to look, and then we will put all of our ingredients together in their bag, and then we'll take it over to the sewing machine and we'll start sewing and pressing. Okay, but first let's build out this little block so you can see how she's gonna look. We're going to need a square on either side. So for every block, we're going to need 4 squares. So 4 times 5, we're gonna need 20 squares per set. And then, this isn't gonna look perfect, of course, because we haven't accounted for our seam allowances yet. So it won't look as nice as it will once it is sewn together, but this is going to give you a good idea. So then on each of our sides, we will also need a rectangle, and I'm just overlapping those to give us a good idea of what it's going to look like. And isn't that so cool how it just starts to pop off? Those sun rays come alive when we have a lot of contrast. So back in week 1, when I was talking about making sure that we have lots of contrast between these rays and the background, you can see how great it looks when you have all that contrast. So it really does look like sun rays popping out. Okay, because I love chain piecing, the way I'm going to set this up is I have my 5 moon units, 2 piles of 10 flying geese, and for each pile, I'm going to need 20 squares and the rectangles. So I'm going to count out 20 squares to go with my flying geese pile. And I'm going to chain piece just this much. Now you could chain piece all your flying geese for all of your blocks, but I personally would rather do it in sections and not get too long of chains and just do a little bit at a time. I am going to chain piece these, and then I'm going to do the same with my rectangles. Grab 20 of these. So I have my 20 squares, 20 rectangles, with flying geese and my moon unit. So this is ready to go to start sewing. When I start sewing, I am going to sew these chains and then set them aside before attaching them to my moon units. That way I can do all of my block A chains, set them aside, all of my block B chains, set them aside. press all of them, and then I will attach them all to the moons all in one shot. So I like to do it in a batch so that all of my sewing work is done at the same time, all of my pressing work is done at the same time. So I'm going to set these aside for when I'm ready to sit down at the sewing machine. I'll just clip these to my moon units so that I remember who goes with what. I just like to keep everything super organized, and then there are no questions about what goes where later on. Okay, so you're just gonna see me counting through blocks B, C, and D, giving everybody their correct number of background units, and then we will take it over to the sewing machine and start sewing. After creating your flying geese, but before sewing them to your background pieces or to your focal print blocks, it is advised to trim your flying geese to 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. This is especially important for beginners who have not worked with flying geese before, or for those of you who really like to be precise in your sewing. I, however, am not somebody who cares a whole lot about being precise. So even though I include those directions in the pattern, I don't follow them personally myself when I'm sewing this quilt. However, if you want to trim your flying geese, you're more than welcome to do so. It's pretty easy. You just need to measure and trim off the excess. You should do that before moving on to this step of sewing on the background pieces. Now, if you're someone like me who just wants to get it done and you don't want to worry too much about trimming, then a little hack that I like to follow is I like to look at those background pieces that I know are already 2.5 by 4.5 inches, and I use that block as a guide for where my seam allowance should go. So I'm not looking at the flying geese unit to measure my 1/4 inch seam. I'm looking at the background piece that's already 2.5 by 4.5, and that is where I place my guide for my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, whether or not you choose to trim your flying geese units or not, you would then move on to sewing your background squares and rectangles to the flying geese unit and sewing them. I, as you can see, prefer to continue using the chain piecing method. I don't mind building a fairly long chain, but I don't like it to be too long. So I keep my color units together. So whatever I am using for the same color block, I'll chain piece those and then move on to the next block. So once you have sewn the seam, then you could bring it over to your pressing mat and you could press. But at this point, I like to use a little seam roller to open up my seams and lay them flat. It's similar to finger pressing, but a little more effective. Now you'll have 2 different lengths of flying geese strips. Starting with the shorter of the 2 lengths, sew them to your focal print block. Again, I prefer chain piecing and sticking with one colorway at a time, and then flip it around and sew the other side all at once. After that, I would use your iron to press the seams and then attach the longer strips to the other end. A note about pressing. The pattern recommends that you press your seams toward the flying geese, so away from that focal print moon. I have actually noticed there are pros and cons to pressing in either direction or even to pressing open, but I have decided that my preferred direction to press is actually toward the moon, so away from the flying geese. This just allows my points to be a little bit more sharp and for the block to lay a little bit more flat. But you can decide to press in whichever direction you prefer. And here we are. We have all of our blocks sewn and pressed and crisp and ready to assemble into our quilt top. So you can see I have each of my 4 different sets. I have block A, B, C, and D in my different colorways, and they're ready to go. I did want to also show you on my blocks how my pressing looks on the back of the block. You can see that I have chosen to press my strips toward the focal print. And that is the way that I prefer it for the sake of how it looks on the front. But again, like I said, you can choose to press these away as instructed in the pattern, and it will be just fine. I'm just telling you this is the way that I prefer it. And then you can also visualize here where I did not trim. I have this little dog ear here and just a little bit of excess there because this wasn't trimmed as perfectly as the others. And it's a little bit, I don't know, messy on the back of this block, but I don't mind it that way. I think it works just fine once it's sandwiched into a quilt. And if you are a person that doesn't like any of these messy little dog ears, then go ahead and trim them. There's nothing wrong with that. I just don't do it. So then at this point, you could go ahead and trim your blocks. I'm not going to trim my block. I'm going to measure it and make sure that it is pretty much close to 12.5 inches square. And if anything is wrong, then I may do a teeny bit of trimming here and there, but I'm not going to need to do much. So if you want to square all of your blocks up perfectly into 12.5 inches, go ahead and do that. But I will just be leaving the block as is and sewing my sashing units onto the block. So I will see you next week. Next week, you are going to need, again, your sewing machine, your pressing mat, your cutting mat, and all your supplies, in addition to your completed blocks. And you're going to want to pull in your sashing pieces and your cornerstone stars. So make sure that you have those ready to go for next week. We're going to be assembling our sashing units that are going to be in between all of our blocks, and then we'll be assembling our quilt. I'm so excited for next week. It's going to be really fun. So we'll see you next week. Bye.